Close enough. That works.
Professor and Department Chair of the Department of Integrated Systems Engineering at the Ohio State University, and you're also Associate Fellow at the Center for Automotive Research. Your nemesis is going to be Luis Augusto. So,
all right. Well, thank you very much to the organizers for inviting me to speak. I'm going to be talking about some work that I've done with a couple of colleagues, Afzal Siddiqui, who will be here at some point this week, I think, but is not here yet, and Antonio Conejo. And the nice thing about Afzal not being here when you have a co-author is any mistakes are obviously his fault, and he's not here to defend himself. So what I'm going to be talking about is some work that we've done looking at merchant or profit-driven storage investment in a restructured electricity industry, and looking at specifically the welfare impacts of storage investment. So the background on this is that we've seen a lot of interest in energy storage over the past 5 to 10 years. This has been driven by a number of market and technical changes. Technical changes in large part has been cost of energy storage technologies coming down and new technologies being developed. On the market side, if we go back 10, 15 years, people started recognizing new potential uses of energy storage. This can be contrasted with the 1960s, 1970s, when storage was primarily viewed as an alternative to building peaking generation. So by virtue of the fact that people found new uses of storage, that means that there were new potential value streams that could be extracted from building these assets. And then we also had on the market side, in many parts of the world, we developed these restructured markets that provide transparent price signals for a lot of the services that energy storage can provide. Those aren't necessarily there for merchant investors if you're in a vertically integrated utility. And then on a forward-looking perspective, there's also the potential role that energy storage is going to play in addressing renewable integration challenges, although realistically you have to get to very high penetrations of renewable energy before it starts making sense to store renewable energy. Now, given this backdrop, we're seeing policymakers taking steps to reduce and in some cases encourage deployment, reduce barriers to or in some cases actively encourage deployment of energy storage. So in California, for instance, for 5 or 6 years now, there's been an actual mandate for the investor-owned utilities to buy or contract for a certain amount of energy storage. And so the question that we wanted to ask is, or that people have been looking at, is whether these policies are well guided. Basically, are there cases in which adding storage to the generation mix could be economically detrimental? So if we look a little bit at some of the literature here that has examined this question, looking at market efficiency impacts of storage. So there have been a few works in which people have looked at the market efficiency impact of storage at the sort of operational stage. So that means you sort of take an exogenously fixed amount of energy storage that you add to the system, and then you just see what are the impacts of using that storage for energy arbitrage purposes. What is the net economic efficiency impact? So as an example, this very first reference here, this is looking at energy storage that is So it's exogenously fixed amount of energy storage that's added to a perfectly competitive generation sector. And as an example, one of the findings there is that if your storage is being owned by consumers, and so consumers could mean, for instance, utilities or load-serving entities, the storage can actually be welfare diminishing compared to a case of no storage. And the reason intuitively is that basically consumers have very strong incentives to overuse the energy storage above the welfare maximizing level because they really want to suppress the on-peak price because that's when consumers are consuming a lot of electricity. So you actually get these cases in which the storage asset itself is losing money in the market, but because of this pecuniary impact on on-peak prices, consumers as a whole are better off. And although consumers are better off, the loss to generators basically outweighs that welfare gain, and so overall society is worse off. There were these two empirical studies that were done looking at adding storage to the Texas and the German power systems. And here, these two studies were not looking at consumer-owned storage. They were looking basically at standalone profit-maximizing merchant storage. And there were cases, so these were computational numerical studies using empirical data, but there were cases in which they found adding storage basically yielded social welfare losses relative to the no storage case. So again, it was kind of counterintuitive that you're adding an additional market participant and you're making the market less efficient. And then there's some other work down here in which people sort of built off of these findings here to see what are cases in which having storage in the market can be welfare diminishing compared to a no storage case. Now, a sort of limitation or gap of the literature that I went through is that all of those analyses basically take an exogenously fixed amount of storage capacity. So you're sort of looking at storage that is there and you're looking at its impact in the operating stage. And so the question that we sought to answer in this work that we've done is to look at whether these cases in which storage is welfare diminishing, whether that's actually an optimal investment decision for the merchant storage operator. Or is it a case that you only get these welfare losses because you sort of exogenously fix and add storage to the market, not taking into account the decision of an investor to whether actually to invest or not. So the way that we address this problem is by basically taking sort of a bi-level modeling approach. At the lower level, you have the actual clearing of the market. So you have generating firms that are making supply decisions during on and off peak periods, and then you also have, if the storage investor decides to invest in storage, then you also have the storage asset basically making charging and discharging decisions to arbitrage price differences between the on and off peak periods. And then at the upper level, you have the decision by the investor whether it's going to actually build the storage asset based on what's going to happen in the market clearing down here. So to summarize what we found, and I'll go through the actual derivation and work in detail. So what we found is that more market power in the generation sector leads to more storage capacity being built by the welfare maximizer relative to the profit maximizer. The rationale behind that is when you have a lot of market power in the generation sector, the welfare maximizer wants to build more storage because it allows it to shift more energy from the off to the on peak period and basically diminish the exercise of market power during the on-peak period by the generators. The profit maximizer essentially has sort of a reversed incentive. The profit maximizer doesn't want to build as much storage because it wants to maintain a larger price difference between the on and off-peak periods. Now, this flips around once the market becomes sufficiently competitive. Basically, once the market becomes sufficiently competitive, the welfare maximizer doesn't need to use as much storage to alleviate exercise of market power on peak. And so conversely, you end up in the situation that the profit maximizer builds more storage because it basically it switches to it switches to a world in which it's trading more volume as opposed to getting a larger price difference between the on and off peak periods. What we found that was, we think, quite interesting is that in this case, when you endogenize the investment decision, as the market gets more competitive, that gives you cases in which storage investment by a profit maximizer can be welfare diminishing relative to no storage. That's actually contrary to this work that I did in another paper, in which the investment decision was not endogenized. When the investment decision is not endogenized, the result is actually the other way around. You can never have welfare losses from having storage in the market if the generation sector is competitive. So there's something unique about endogenizing the investment decision that sort of flips the efficiency impact of adding storage to the market. So just to go through really quickly how we set up the model that we looked at here. So as I outlined before, it's sort of a two-stage modeling framework. Stage one is where you have the investment decision by the storage investor or storage operator, storage owner. And then stage two, you have the operational decision of the storage asset as well as the generators making production decisions. We model the generators as competing in a Nash-Corneau type framework. We leave out consideration of uncertainty and transmission constraints. And so because of the sequential two-stage nature of this problem, we basically work backwards, first deriving the equilibria in stage two, and then moving backwards to the investment decision. So in stage two, which is the operating stage, we basically assume that there are two operating periods that correspond to off and on-peak periods. So period one is off-peak, period two is on-peak. And as far as our stylized results are concerned, we consider cases with linear generation cost functions. We also did numerical calculations for a case with quadratic cost, meaning linear marginal cost. A lot of the results still carry over, but you can't come up with the nice, clean analytical results that we get with constant marginal cost.
Do they have capacity constraints?
Pardon me?
Do they have capacity constraints?
No, there are no capacity constraints on the generators. And then we have linear inverse demand functions in the two periods, and then we place these restrictions, which basically, these restrictions ensure that the period two price is always higher than the period one price, which is sort of sticking with this notion of being an off-peak versus an on-peak period. And then we have the storage device, which has some fixed efficiency. And so what the storage device can do is it can charge some amount of energy in period one, and then taking into account those efficiency losses, it discharges this amount in period two, So you have to charge more in period 1 than you get to discharge in period 2. And then in stage 1, basically, we have an investor that decides how much storage capacity to install. We just take a simple case with a quadratic investment cost to sort of take into account, try and take into account that that storage gets more expensive as you scale it and make it larger. So basically, as I said, we have to work backwards through the 2 stages of the problem to derive the equilibria. So we start off in the 2nd stage. Each of the generators basically solves a profit maximization problem that looks like this. So there's profit from the off-peak period and then profit from the on-peak period. They're making their supply decisions. And it's very straightforward to just derive the KKT conditions, show that you have a symmetric equilibrium, and then you plug these quantities back into the on and off-peak price functions. And this is basically what the on and off-peak prices look like, parameterized by D. So D is essentially the, that's the amount of energy that is charged off-peak and discharged on-peak. So we can essentially parameterize the production decisions of the firms in the 2 periods by the action taken by the storage operator, and then we can also parameterize what the equilibrium prices look like in the on and off-peak periods, also based on how much energy is being charged and discharged by the storage operator. Once we've done that, then we can also write out the storage operator's problem. So the storage operator is also solving this profit maximization problem. It's basically just based on the price difference between the on and off peak period. We have to multiply by this parameter f, that's 1 over the efficiency. So that basically takes into account the energy that's lost in storing the energy between off and on peak. And a capacity constraint, same as before, you can write out KKT conditions, and the KKT conditions basically give you 3 possible outcomes. So the first one here is if the price difference between the off and on peak period is sufficiently small, well, in that case, it doesn't make sense to store any energy. There's not enough of a price difference to arbitrage. Conversely, if you don't have enough capacity to bring this price difference down to the sort of threshold level, then you max out the amount of energy that you store. And then this is the intermediate case in which you store some energy, but you don't get up to the capacity of the storage device, because if you do, you shrink the price difference enough that it no longer is profit maximizing for you to keep storing more energy. Now, the important thing to mention is that once we endogenize the investment decision, you really only have this situation arise in the operating stage. And the reason is that if you have this situation arise, that basically means that you overbuilt, you overinvested in storage. You built capacity that you're not actually going to use in the operating stage. Now, this is in part because we take this very simple framework where there are just 2 operating periods, a single on and single off peak period. If we were to change that a little bit and have multiple periods, you would basically end up in a situation where the capacity constraint is binding in at least 1 period. And then in other periods, you could end up in this type of a situation here. So once we've sort of figured out what happens in the operating stage, then we just put this profit maximization problem for the storage operator at the investment stage and taking that observation that when we endogenize the investment decision, the investment capacity will be, or the capacity will be exhausted. This simplifies like this, and so we end up with this expression that gives us the profit maximizing investment level. Now, what we did next was we contrasted that with what the welfare maximizer's operational and investment decisions look like. So basically, you have to write up a bunch of expressions that give you consumer and producer welfare in the two stages. You write out this welfare maximization problem. I guess I should mention the generators, the generator equilibrium isn't changed by having a welfare maximizer, because the generators are still essentially making their production decisions in the two stages, reacting to the amount of energy that's charged and moved between the off and on peak period. So basically, these functions that I had before, which give their production levels as a function of D and the on and off peak prices as a function of D, those are still here. Really all that changes is that the storage operator is not maximizing profit here. Instead, it's maximizing total welfare. And so its operating decisions look a little bit different when we solve those KKT conditions. Again, once we endogenize the investment level, we're only going to have this case arise in the operating stage. And so we write out, again, this welfare maximization problem at the investment stage, and the KKT conditions give us this welfare maximizing investment level for the welfare maximizer. All right, so now what I can do is I can go through really quickly and just look at some of the sort of analytical insights that we can get for this case with linear cost, and then some numerical examples as well. So first of all, the first thing that we can show is that what I said before, which is there is some critical cutoff value, which we call n bar. So if you have fewer generation firms than n bar, you're basically in a situation in which the generation market is relatively uncompetitive. So the welfare maximizer wants to build a lot more storage than the profit maximizer wants to. And again, as I said before, that's because the welfare maximizer is using storage to mitigate the exercise of market power on peak. Once the market becomes more competitive, so you go above n bar firms, then that flips around. Basically, the welfare maximizer starts investing in less storage capacity compared to the profit maximizer. The way that you show this is basically you take those two expressions for the profit and the welfare maximizing level of storage investment, you set them equal to each other, and you get a downward facing parabola. You get a quadratic function in n, and so that has a unique positive root. So that unique positive root is basically the value of n bar, this critical threshold number. We can show how n bar is affected by the investment cost parameter or the generation cost parameter. We can show that both investment levels decrease as you get more firms. So as n goes up, the amount of storage capacity that is profit and welfare maximizing decreases. What this figure is showing, this is showing that so this is showing that quadratic function that you get from setting the profit and welfare maximizers storage investment levels equal to each other. And so this point where these functions hit 0, these basically give the threshold number of firms where the profit and welfare maximizing investment levels are equal to each other. So with this set of parameters here, we get that about roughly one firm is where you have that threshold. Here where we have decreased the storage investment cost or decrease the generation cost, the threshold increases a little bit. So you need the market to become a little bit more competitive for you to hit that threshold level. Here we're showing for these baseline values of 10 and 20. This is showing what the welfare maximizing and profit maximizing storage capacity looks like. So again, we're getting this crossover point here, and as the market becomes more competitive, the welfare maximizer, essentially the amount of storage that it needs to build, diminishes and goes to zero. The profit maximizer still wants to retain relatively higher amount of storage capacity. So now this is the other sort of high-level result that we ended up with, which is showing that there's another critical threshold value, which I'm calling N tilde here, and if the number of firms in the market is greater than this threshold value N tilde, then you end up in a situation in which the profit maximizer storage investment level actually gives you welfare losses compared to a no storage case. And so as I said, this sort of contrasts the earlier findings where people had found when you exogenously fix the amount of storage capacity, earlier findings basically said that you were not getting welfare losses when the market was competitive. So this is standing in contrast to that when you endogenize the investment decision. This is just showing what the change in social welfare is between the no storage case and then either the welfare maximizing or profit maximizing case. So as expected, once we hit about 4 firms, we actually have welfare losses from the profit maximizing level of storage investment. With the welfare maximizer, we never get there. However, once the market becomes sufficiently competitive, there are really no welfare gains from the welfare maximizer building storage because there's not really that much market power being exercised to obviate. This is just contrasting what the welfare maximizers and profit maximizers storage capacity looks like. Well, what the welfare looks like as a function of the storage capacity, and then what it translates into in terms of welfare that social welfare that's earned. I'm going to skip this part where we talk about using ramping charges to basically align incentives between the profit and welfare maximizer. I'll just jump here to the end. So at a high level, basically what we have found is that once you endogenize the investment decision, it seems as though the interactions between the competitiveness of the generation sector and having energy storage in the market sort of flips from the case in which the investment decision is not endogenized. So before we were only seeing welfare losses when the generation sector is uncompetitive. And here we're seeing that once the generation sector becomes sufficiently competitive with endogenized investment decisions, we are seeing cases in which there are welfare losses. Thank you very much.
So good morning, everyone, And Ramteen, thank you so much for your presentation. And I've enjoyed very much this article. And I would have just one very pragmatic question for you, which is to what extent are your assumptions constraining your outcomes? Because you have some strong ones, but also more general comments that I would appreciate your feedback as well. Is that what I see from a practical perspective is that the incorporation of uncertainty, of the intermittency of renewables, for example, can change very much the perception of value of storage. And this can be very much accelerated by the presence of aggregators, which basically are figures that try to capture more and more value from the market that can in turn increase the value of storage as a resource. So this would be the topic number 2, that if you can make a comment, I would appreciate. And while you were presenting, I had just a very last idea that I would like to bring up for discussion as well, which is the fact that in some markets, it is possible that the presence of storage may decrease indeed welfare. For example, in countries as some of those in Latin America, as Brazil, for example, where price differentials in the market, they tend to be very small because of the big presence of storage capacity in the hydro plants already today. This may, at first sight, shows that, well, we don't need storage devices. But the storage does has a value in those countries on the network side as a transmission, in quotes, devices, which raises a very interesting regulatory discussion, which is what should be the regulatory figure of a storage. Should the storage be a generator, a transmission device, which connects to the business model of the device and on the remuneration alternative? This is more a broader discussion, but these are the comments that I would have for the time being, and thank you so much, Ramteen, for your presentation once again.
All right, so thank you for those comments. So as far as the results being driven by the assumptions, I think that's a very valid point. So one obvious one is that we obviously, the way that this model is structured, we give a lot of market power to a single, essentially monopolist storage investor. And so, I think a natural extension would be to look at what happens when you make the investment stage also competitive, as opposed to having a single storage investor. And then, obviously another facet to add to that would be to also endogenize generation capacity, although we don't have generation capacity constraints in the model as we've set it up right now. So there are a lot of ways in which the assumptions of this model could be relaxed, and so the results could change quite a bit relative to what we've shown. Now, the question about uncertainty, I think that opens up a broader set of questions, because what we are looking at is using storage only for energy arbitrage. And once you start adding uncertainty to the picture, there are potentially a lot more higher value uses of storage beyond just using it for energy arbitrage. So frequency regulation is, for instance, in the US at least, is essentially where all the merchant storage investment is taking place. And so that's an application that's very much, it's not driven by, but uncertainty is a major factor in sort of how you operate and size energy storage. Your third question about, whether to treat storage as a generation or a transmission or some other type of asset. I can give you my opinion of how this is done in the United States, which is I don't think it's done well. So in the United States, the state of Texas, which, as Dick said this morning, is not subject to FERC jurisdiction. So the state of Texas is kind of unique because the state regulates both the wholesale market and the retail market. Now, the reason I bring this up is because in Texas, the utilities there have been contending with the fact that state law doesn't allow the utilities to own assets that participate in the wholesale market. So there have been cases in which utilities have wanted to build storage projects primarily for distribution or transmission relief, but the only way that they could economically justify that is if, in addition to the T&D relief, they could also earn some supplemental revenue by bidding those assets into the market. And the way that the regulatory rules are set up in Texas, the utilities can't actually do that. Now, outside of Texas in the United States, some people that you talk to, they claim that FERC Order 841, which is sort of requiring all the ISOs and RTOs to basically develop market participation rules for energy storage, that's going to fix all these problems. I fundamentally disagree with that because the wholesale markets don't capture all these transmission, well, they capture some transmission, but they certainly don't capture distribution uses of energy storage. So, so I think the question that you ask raises a much broader question, which is how you actually design regulatory and market rules for energy storage if you really want to capture all these value streams. And I don't know about the rest of the world, but I can say fairly definitively in the United States, we do not have a worked out model for doing that. Whether Europe or other parts of the world do, I'm not well informed enough to be able to answer that.
There are some questions here. David, then myself.
So you have a very flexible model that you can use to answer a number of questions. But the curious thing is you have the same variable cost peak and off-peak. And therefore, obviously, competitive equilibrium is the same price peak and off-peak, and therefore there's no storage.
Mm-hmm.
All you need to do is to say we have peaking plant which has a higher variable cost, lower capital cost, and then there's a price difference between the two. And then the competitive equilibrium may or may not have storage, depending on the economics of investment in storage versus peaking plant. And there you probably do have to have some values of loss layers and things like that, and possibly therefore some uncertainty. But the model is pretty flexible, so you can put that in.
Right. So as I said, the stylized results we showed for this case with constant marginal cost, which you're absolutely correct, it's in the limit it's uninteresting because once the market is sufficiently competitive, there's no price difference between the two periods. But we worked out numerical examples with linear marginal cost. So with linear marginal cost, regardless of if the market is perfectly competitive, you still have price differences between on and off peak. And so the results still carry, well, we still see the results, but we can't, at least we haven't been able to analytically show that, you actually have these thresholds where, profit maximizing storage investment becomes welfare diminishing. But we can numerically show with examples that does happen when you have linear as opposed to constant marginal costs.
Ben?
Ramteen, I enjoyed the talk, and I want to hear a little bit about the ramping charge. What is it, and why does it mitigate market power? Without going through all the slides, can you?
Yeah, so
give us a teaser, and we'll look at your slides later.
Yeah, so the ramping charge, the idea here is that you basically, you essentially place a cost on changes in production levels between the two periods. And so depending on whether that's positive or negative, that charge, it can either incentivize increasing or decreasing the difference between the production levels in the two periods. So it's like
it rises from generation costs, and so it's propagated to the market.
Pardon me?
The consumers are seeing this. Who's paying this charge? Is it regulatory?
It's being imposed on generators.
Okay. So if a generator changes its output, it pays a tax, which
Yes.
might represent its cost of moving around.
Exactly.
Okay.
And it's a strange, funky, blunt instrument. to align the incentives of the profit maximizer to build the same amount of storage that the welfare maximizer would.
You're proposing this as a regulatory instrument to mitigate market power, or are you just saying, oh, isn't this?
I wouldn't say I'm proposing it as an instrument. I'd say it's just it's something that we looked at as an instrument to align the incentives. I personally would not. I'm not personally proposing it as something that should be done.
I also enjoyed your talk, similar to something I'm working on, so it's something familiar. Essentially, in your model, as far as I understand it, storage is essentially a market power mitigation device. So you call it a storage, but it could also be an interconnection capacity. It could be somebody acting in the market, buying and selling. I think there's a very relevant question also from a college perspective, which is who should be owning this storage? So what about your model if the storage is not owned by an independent owner, but rather by one of the generators? And I think these questions, so for instance, you know these papers on I think Jim Bushnell has a paper on hydro, the use of the excess of market power through hydro production. Essentially what he finds is that generators might have an incentive to use water rather than in order to pick rather to use it for peak shaving, rather use it off time in order to press price and let price go up very high in peak times. So I think your model is suitable enough and flexible, as David said, to analyze this issue about what are the effects of different ownership structures of this storage and the integration between generation and storage.
Yeah. So the first question, I wouldn't characterize the storage as just being a mechanism to mitigate market power because it actually generates essentially merchandising surplus based on the difference between the on and off peak price. Now, in terms of how it's effectively used by the welfare maximizer, yes, what it essentially is doing is it's decreasing competitiveness off peak and it's increasing competitiveness on peak. So it is working out to be a market mitigation.
Yeah, there's no cost related to what David said. There's no cost differences. So the only effect of the storage is to mitigate market power on peak, and there's no
right. But
no
if you
effect
if you take linear marginal cost, so there is actually a cost difference. Most of these results still carry through. So in that case, you are actually you're not just substituting higher price on peak energy with lower price off peak energy. You're actually substituting higher cost on peak energy with lower cost off peak energy. As to your question about ownership structure, so I've done some work looking at ownership structure, but not with the investment level endogenized. And so you get, well, I guess I said half of the story there. So half of the story is that if consumers or if their utilities or their load-serving entities own storage, you tend to get these equilibria in which the storage is overused relative to the welfare optimum, and you actually get net welfare losses because the gains that consumers get are outweighed by losses to generators. If, on the other hand, you put if storage is owned by the generators, you basically get the reverse effect. Storage is underused relative to the welfare maximizer because the generators want to maintain higher prices on peak. So they don't want their storage asset competing with their generation asset in the on-peak period. And so you can get cases where you can have cases in which You can have cases in which generation-owned storage can also be welfare diminishing compared to a no storage case. But that again, that work has only looked at cases in which the investment decision is not endogenized. So we haven't extended that yet to see whether those results carry through when the investment decision is being endogenously made.
Excellent. Thanks so much. I think we are running out of time, and we should just go to them.
All right, thank you.